Hello ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for tuning in to today's short screencast about the League of Nations, its history and its weaknesses. For this screencast and lots of others too, you can visit www.historychappy.com. Most of us have probably heard of the United Nations, which is an organisation that was set up after the Second World War to help avoid countries resorting to conflict and violence to solve their problems. The United Nations discuss and work on issues such as healthcare, education and global development. They can also provide peacekeepers, and you can instantly recognise them from their blue headwear. However, the United Nations was not the first global peacekeeping organisation. In fact, the first was a group called the League of Nations, which was set up in 1919 after the end of the First World War. Its job was very similar to that of the United Nations which we have today. It looked at healthcare, education and poverty around the world, but its main aim was to ensure that countries did not resort to violence or warfare in order to solve their problems, as they had done during World War I. We need to remember that World War I was a very vicious conflict, the like of which the world had never seen. And countries around the world were very keen that those images of death were not to be repeated at any cost. Therefore, when the League of Nations was initially set up, it seemed like a very good idea, in theory. We all know that just 20 years after the League of Nations was set up in 1919, by 1939 World War II had broken out. We need to then look at some of the weaknesses of the League of Nations and why it failed to prevent that conflict. The first major weakness of the League of Nations was the fact that many countries didn't join the League or joined very late. The United States of America, even then one of the world's strongest and most powerful countries, never joined. The Weimar Republic, also known as Germany at that time, was not allowed to join until the mid-1920s. The Soviet Union, or Russia, also didn't join till very late. Therefore, the League lacked the power and authority of some of the world's biggest countries, and this helped undermine the organisation from the very start. Another major weakness of the League of Nations was that it was very slow to make decisions. The main decision-making body, or their council, only met 3 times a year, and all the decisions taken by the League had to be unanimously agreed by all members. Therefore, it was slow, and on top of that, needed everyone to agree to every decision for the League to actually do anything. The third major weakness was that the League of Nations did not have an army of its own. Rather, it had to borrow troops from its member countries. Needless to say, many members of the League of Nations were very reluctant to supply their troops to go on to peacekeeping missions where they might be in danger. Therefore, the League had no army of its own and had to rely on the goodwill of its members, which wasn't very forthcoming at the time. The fourth major weakness of the League of Nations was the fact that economic sanctions were its only real weapon against aggressive countries. However, even economic sanctions didn't work, because countries who were subject to them could simply trade with other countries who weren't members of the League, such as, you guessed it, the United States of America. So countries could simply go round the sanctions and trade with non-member countries. A prime example of the failures of the League of Nations was when the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, which is today known as Ethiopia. The League of Nations failed to take any decisive action whatsoever against Mussolini. In fact, this cartoon demonstrates how toothless the League was in the face of aggression. This cartoon shows Benito Mussolini being told off by figures representing France and Britain. It says here, "We don't want to fight, But by jingo if you do, we shall probably issue a joint memorandum suggesting a mild disapproval of you. We know that a dictator like Mussolini, intent on expanding his empire, is not going to listen to a telling off. Indeed, many countries, as time wore on, simply ignored the League of Nations and did just what they wanted anyway. So as time wore on, the League of Nations was exposed as being more and more toothless and weaker. By 1939, the League of Nations had been exposed as having failed in trying to help the world avoid a second global conflict, as the Second World War broke out. So, to summarise, the League of Nations' main weaknesses were: it had no power above and beyond issuing economic sanctions, it had no army of its own, it was too slow to make decisions, and some of the major countries of the world, like the USA, were simply not members.